Hey folks, so in this video we're going to continue on a little bit in this book, what life was like in the age of chivalry. So this is medieval Europe. Medieval Europe, AD 800 to 1500. Or we would now call this CE 800 to 1500. This book's a little old. In this photo we show, or this painting I should say, it says, using scaling ladders and bombards for hurling stones, English soldiers attacked the French at the siege of Brest during the 100 Years' War. Siege warfare, an important part of medieval military operations, involved prolonged battles in which armies attempted to breach the fortifications of their opponents, who, cut off from supplies, slowly starved. So I'm going to flip through this part kind of quickly. Just kind of quickly look at a few of the photos. There's some wooden statues. Medieval period, pretty highly detailed. We sometimes refer to the medieval period as Middle Ages, as though, and kind of act like there was no art or anything, but there in fact was quite a lot going on. Here's French soldiers, many heavily armed, begin their retreat at the Battle of Crusades as the English army advances on them. The English, whose longbows and strategic planning presented a revolution in warfare and brought them an overwhelming victory, lost only 100 men to France's 1,500. Here's servants prepare birds for the hunt as German Emperor Frederick II Wright embarks on a favorite pastime, a day of falconing. There's a hunting horn. And down here we have the call goes out during the chase as the hunting party closes in on its prey. I'll read this little box section. A man's home, ... Throughout the Middle Ages, Europe's rulers built strongholds along the frontiers of their realms to guard against the constant threat of invasion. The earliest castles were simple earth and timber forts, located along trade routes, or likely avenues of attack. As kingdoms grew in power and wealth, these forts were replaced by massive permanent structures with thick stone walls. The first requirement for a castle was that it be difficult to reach, and the easiest way to do this was to build on a naturally inaccessible location. William Marshall's Crepstow Castle, for example, rises from a cliff on the Wye River in Wales, leaving attackers few lanes of approach. Others were built on islands or steep hilltops. Where there was no natural defense, builders created one by digging a moat around the castle. Some moats were filled with water diverted from a nearby river, but most were not, as even a dry moat presented a formidable obstacle. The only access over the moat was a bridge, which could be drawn into the castle. Large gatehouses guarded entry to the bridge. The castles themselves boasted ingenious defenses. And here in this little part, Keen's Castle drawbridge, which hung from the two protruding beams, was destroyed long ago. That's this guy. Here's a parapet at Beersell Castle, far right, has openings for dropping stones and shooting arrows. If the walls were breached, defenders could slide down the chute at center into the lake. And on this side, we have, situated in the middle of a natural lake, Belgium's Beersel Castle was virtually unassailable. Here's some interior of castles. Here's a kitchen in Germany, Eltz Castle. This little box here talks about plumbing systems. The plumbing systems of medieval castles were remarkably sophisticated. A cistern on the top floor provided running water which fed sinks throughout the castle. Toilets were usually built jutting out of an exterior wall, like the narrow one in the above photo. This is Hot Königsberg Castle in Germany. Waste fell through a hole in the floor, either into a pit that was periodically flushed out or directly into a river or lake. The bedroom at Eltz Castle still contains the enclosed berth in which one of the masters of the household slept. Attendants often slept in the same room. Castle life was centered around a great hall, like that of England's Headington Castle. That's this. Here the Lord both took his meals and conducted his business. In this photo or painting, while musicians entertain, a stream of servants carry an elaborate evening's feast for the enjoyment of hosts, their guests, and the dogs of the house. Here we have a French couple contemplate their next moves in a friendly game of chess. Noble lords and ladies whiled away many leisure hours playing the popular game. Here's courtly love. One of Henry II's knights plunges a sword into the back of Thomas Becket as the Archbishop kneels at the altar in Canterbury Cathedral. Declaring himself ready to die for my lord, Becket was hacked to pieces in the cathedral's transept. A new knight receives his sword, spurs, helmet, and shield, and prays that he will perform his duties well. He would then kneel before a sponsor who would tap him lightly with a sword, bestowing upon him the honor of knighthood. A medieval feminist, renowned author Christine de Pizan presents a volume of her work to Isabel of Bavaria in the Queen's bedchamber as ladies-in-waiting look on. Under the patronage of the Queen's husband, Charles VI of France, Christine began her career by writing love poems, but later turned to more serious topics such as history, ethics, and religion. Best remembered for her tracts in support of women, Christine wrote about heroic female figures, chastised others for contemptuous attitudes toward women, and promoted education for girls. Medieval war games. By the end of the 11th century, a new weapon found its way onto the battlefields of Europe, the couched lance, with which a knight could strike an enemy from a distance of about 5 feet. But lances were unwieldy and required a great deal of practice to handle effectively. Knights soon found that mock combat provided an excellent means of training with the lance. At first, these simulated battles, called tournaments, were messy affairs in which any number of men would charge headlong at each other with lances and swords, the goal being to unhorse as many other knights as possible. Any knight who knocked another to the ground could lay claim to his opponent's horse and armor. There were few rules, and injuries and fatalities were common. But as tournaments grew in popularity, they turned from blood sport into pageant, governed by elaborate codes of conduct and attended by large crowds. By the late 1100s, tournaments were often choreographed to reflect the chivalric romance of the day, and were held to celebrate events like royal weddings and births. Large-scale pageants soon gave way to smaller contests known as jousts, where individuals galloped toward each other, lances poised, across an enclosed area called a list. The change in format made it easier to determine the winner. Here's some pictures of jousting. Here's a diagram, depicts 3 tournament contests. Different things, different contests. The tilt, a wooden fence separating the jousters, helped keep the horses running in a straight line and also gave some protection to both animal and rider. The tournament's victor receives his prize, a jewel adorned with ostrich feathers. But for the knight, the real prize was in the horses and armor he could win from his opponents. Heraldic art developed from the practice of decorating armor in order to identify knights in the field. The lion rampant, a symbol of nobility on the shield of William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, probably signifies the knight's closeness with the royal family. Marshal's devotion to them earned him the job of guardian to young Henry III. Despite his advanced age, Marshal agreed to the task, stating, "If everyone else abandoned the king, do you know what I would do? I would carry him on my shoulders, step by step, from island to island, from country to country, and I would not fail him, even if it meant begging my bread." I guess that was a medieval version of kissing up. Okay, so I wanted to get to this section, In God's Name, the Crusades. And I'm not really an expert on the Crusades, despite having, read some on it, and it seems like every time I learn more, I then kind of forget it later, so I'm not an expert that really remembers a lot about it, but I thought I could read through and look at some of these maps, and here's a chronology. We'll take a look at that. I'll start with this part. In God's Name, the Crusades. The frenzy of the barbarians has devastated the churches of God in the East, and has even, shame to say, seized into slavery the holy city of Christ, Jerusalem. With these words, Pope Urban II hoped to persuade Christians from all over Europe to join a special kind of pilgrimage, a holy war against the Muslims who had taken over Jerusalem as they swept through the Near East, spreading their new religion of Islam. And they responded, for in the Middle Ages no layperson could rise to a greater calling than to join the Crusades. Taking up the sign of the cross, thousands of God-fearing, God-loving men and women risked death to reclaim the Holy Land from the infidels. led by zealots armed with little more than their faith, and by nobles and knights with lances and swords, like the crusader here, seen with his mount. They became a horde outnumbering the sand of the seashore or the stars of heaven, as one eyewitness reported, carrying palms and bearing crosses on their shoulders. Not only did these pilgrims travel far from their homes and families, most had put all their money into the journey, believing they were earning absolution of their sins and gaining an assured place in heaven. The Crusaders lived in violent times. In the 11th century, Europe was only just emerging from the Dark Ages, and warring factions preyed on one another. Brutality was common, life was hard. The sacrifices the Crusades called for must have seemed to many merely an extension of the demands of daily existence, but with the one attractive difference: these would bring salvation. The First Crusade, conceived as a military action by Pope Urban II, with nobles and kings serving as Christ's warriors, attracted far more common folk than anticipated. Untrained, undisciplined, and poorly led, they made up the first wave of the more than 50,000 Europeans who began the 2,000-mile overland trek. Thousands died along the way, thousands more perished trying to take 2 Muslim strongholds. In the next wave, knights on horseback and foot soldiers triumphantly seized several cities as they advanced towards Jerusalem. Yet they also suffered enormously. 500 died of thirst on one day alone, and their hunger grew so extreme that some ate their horses and even the flesh of the enemy. Their forbearance and bravery, however, became the example by which future generations of crusaders, including England's Richard the Lionhearted and the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, took up the cross and followed the long and arduous routes portrayed in simplified form on the map at right. So this map here. So let's take a look at this chronology in this map. So this green line shows the First Crusade. So here's Vienna, Belgrade, Constantinople. First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders in 1099. And then in 1147, so they held Jerusalem for some time. And this is purple line is the Second Crusade, which followed a similar line, Nuremberg to Buda. You know, and country lines at this time would have been were less defined than they are now. So it's not like people would have necessarily considered themselves the same nationality as they might today. So that purple line is the Second Crusade, and it went all the way to Damascus. And it looks like it traveled partially over the water, the Mediterranean Sea, by Cyprus. Second Crusade, Jerusalem taken by the Muslims in 1187. And then the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, Richard the Lionhearted takes Jaffa, but Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands, 1191 to 1192. So that's this orange line from Cologne all the way down. And at Tarsus. You can see the Sicily, what is now Italy. Here's Rome, Cyprus, Sardinia. That was some trek. And the fourth crusade is in this light green one, which is difficult to see. Starts in Venice. Looks like they traveled by ship to Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204. Crusaders sack Constantinople in 1204. And the Fifth Crusade is this dark blue line from Zara. And again, traveling by ship. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221. The Sixth Crusade is this kind of reddish orange here. Bari in what is now Italy. Again, traveling by ship. They land on Cyprus and then looks like they go ashore there and all the way to Jerusalem. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, Jerusalem returns to Christian control for 15 years from 1229 to 1244. The Seventh Crusade is this purple one. Starts off near Avignon in Aiguille-Morte. So that's roughly where now we would call this France, or this would be France. And then that is again, looks like a ship sailing to Cyprus. And once again, launches towards Cairo and Mansoura, Acre. In that one, the Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1250, and the Eighth and final crusade looks like it was in two waves. Eighth Crusade, 1269 to 1270. It looks like they went off in two waves. Started on overland, and took to the Mediterranean Sea, went to Sicily, and then took off again to sea, and went to Cyprus, and then Acre, and ultimately Jerusalem. Muslims, and in that one, the Muslims seize and destroy last Christian outposts in the Holy Land, 1291. Here's knights joining the crusade. It says knights joining the crusade paid dearly for the privilege. Their equipment and steed alone could come to twice their annual income. Here's defensive gear. Looks like a lot of chain mail. To protect themselves from Muslim arrows, mounted knights wore iron helmets and shirts and leggings of chainmail. But their armor weighed them down and gave the more lightly clad enemy on their swift horses the advantage in cavalry battles. Here's Louis the Ninth. Departs on crusade. He converted a tiny village into a major port for the shipping of his equipment and supplies. Pope Innocent III placed collection chests such as the one below in every church to raise funds for the Crusades. This says Jerusalem, a pawn in a holy war. When the earliest Crusaders beheld Jerusalem for their first time on June 7th, 1099, it lay sparkling in the sunshine like a vision of heaven. Deeply moved, they fell to their knees and offered thanks to God for bringing them there. But they must have known in their hearts that taking the walled city, one of the most heavily fortified in its day, would be far from easy. Having trusted in God to provide for their needs, the 13,000 besiegers soon themselves became besieged. Unable to mount the walls because they had no scaling ladders, they found themselves with very little food and water and other provisions. Shrewdly, the city's defenders had taken the precautions of filling up or poisoning the local wells. But then, almost miraculously, the fleet of English and Genoese ships suddenly appeared off the coast, bringing both carpenters and wood with which to build ladders and mobile towers so they could gain the ramparts. On July 10, after these structures had been put together, the Crusaders attacked, advancing slowly through a volley of flaming arrows, all while inching their cumbersome towers toward the forbidding walls. 5 days later, one of the platforms stood in place, and the men began pouring into Jerusalem. Inside the holy city, the Crusaders took their swords and slashed at the civilians fleeing before them, killing them and dismembering them, and showing no mercy even to women and children. The leaders of the action wrote to the Pope, "If you want to know what was done to the enemies we found in the city, know this, that in the portico of Solomon and in his temple, our men rode in the blood of the Saracens up to the knees of their horses." After Jerusalem fell on the 15th, the dead were so numerous that their bodies formed funeral pyres as big as houses. Where once an estimated 20,000 Muslims and Jews had lived, none now remained. The brutal aftermath. Sanctioned, they believed, by God, the first Crusade knights killed all they met in Jerusalem. The 12th century historian reported that one could not nonetheless look on the multitude of corpses without horror, scattered arms and legs heaped on the floor on all sides. Drums and horns signaled the Muslims' final assault on Acre. They later hung Christian heads from their horses' necks to present them to the Sultan. Coming home, when they returned, some Crusaders found their wives waiting for them, their homes and livelihoods intact. Greedy relatives and neighbors often preyed on the men's families, usurping their property. Few Crusaders came back rich. Some had little more to show for their suffering than a small cross like the one above. For the man who failed at God's work, no worse fate could await him than the contempt of his countrymen. And when an entire crusade failed, the whole community shared the blame, for surely it was their own sinfulness that had caused God to withhold his blessing from the venture. So I think we'll end there tonight. hope you enjoyed this reading and looking at some of these paintings of medieval art about the Crusades and other things. Maybe found it relaxing and somewhat educational. If you like the video, hit the like button and maybe subscribe to the channel if you're not a subscriber. Does me. I really appreciate it. And but most importantly, thanks for watching. And I'll talk to you soon.